Chapter 6, Section 3, Biodiversity. Those of us who love nature find much to admire in the many forms of life that surrounds us. We marvel at the soaring flight of an eagle, the majestic movements of a whale, and the colors of spring wildflowers. Variety, the saying goes, is the spice of life. But variety in the biosphere gives us more than just interesting things to look at. Human society takes part in local and global food webs and energy cycles and depends on both the physical and biological life support systems of our planet. For that reason, our well-being is closely tied to the well-being of a great variety of other organisms, including many that are neither majestic nor beautiful to our eyes. The value of biodiversity. Another word for variety is diversity. Therefore, biological diversity, or biodiversity, is the sum total of all the genetically based variety of all organisms in the biosphere. Ecosystem diversity includes the variety of habitats, communities, and ecological processes in the living world. Species diversity refers to the number of different species in the biosphere. So far, biologists have identified and named about 1.5 million species and estimate that millions more may be discovered in the future. Genetic diversity refers to the sum total of all the different forms of genetic information carried by all organisms living on Earth today. Within each species, genetic diversity refers to the total of all the different forms of genes present in that species. You will read about genetic information later in this book. Biodiversity is one of Earth's greatest natural resources. Species of many kinds have provided us with foods, industrial products, and medicines, including painkillers, antibiotics, heart drugs, antidepressants, and anti-cancer drugs. For example, the rosy periwinkle plant in Figure 6-14 is the source of substances used to treat certain cancers. The biodiversity represented by wild plants and animals is a kind of library of genetic information upon which humans can draw for future use. For example, most crop plants have wild relatives with useful traits such as resistance to disease or pests. When biodiversity is lost, potential sources of material with significant value to the biosphere and humankind may be lost with it. Threats to biodiversity. Human activity can reduce biodiversity by altering habitats, hunting species to extinction, introducing toxic compounds into food webs, and introducing foreign species to new environments. As human activities alter ecosystems, this may lead to the extinction of species. Extinction occurs when a species disappears from all or part of its range. A species whose population size is declining in a way that places it in danger of extinction is called an endangered species. As the population of an endangered species declines, the species loses genetic diversity, an effect that can make it even more vulnerable to extinction. Habitat alteration. When land is developed, natural habitats may be destroyed. Habitats supply organisms' needs, and they are a limited resource. The animals who live in these habitats, such as the coyote in Figure 6-15, must learn new behaviors in order to survive in these new environments. Species' long-term survival depends on the preservation of this limited resource. As habitats disappear, the species that live in those habitats vanish. In addition, development often splits ecosystems into species or pieces, a process called habitat fragmentation. As a result, remaining pieces of habitats become biological islands. We usually think of islands as bits of land surrounded by water, but a biological island can be any patch of habitat surrounded by a different habitat. New York Central Park is an island of trees and grass in a sea of concrete. In suburbs, patches of forest can be surrounded by farms, houses, and shopping malls. Habitat islands are very different from large, continuous ecosystems. The smaller the island, the fewer species can live there. The smaller their populations can be, and the more vulnerable they are to further disturbances or climate change. Demand for wildlife products. Throughout history, humans have pushed some animal species to extinction by hunting them for food or other products. In the 1800s, hunting caused the extinction of species such as the Carolina parakeet and the passenger pigeon. Today, in the United States, endangered species are protected from hunting. Hunting, however, still threatens rare animals in parts of Africa, South America, and Southeast Asia. Some species are hunted for meat, fur, or hides. Others are hunted because people think that their body parts, such as horns, have medicinal properties. The Convention of International Trade in Endangered Species bans international trade in products derived from a list of endangered species. Unfortunately, it is difficult to enforce laws in remote wilderness areas. Pollution. Many forms of pollution can threaten biodiversity, but one of the most serious problems occurs when toxic compounds accumulate in the tissues of organisms. The history of DDT, one of the first widely used pesticides, explains the situation well. At first, DDT seemed to be a perfect pesticide. It is cheap, remains active for a long time, kills many different insects, and can control agricultural pests and disease-carrying mosquitoes. When DDT was sprayed, it drained into rivers and streams at low concentrations that seemed harmless. But DDT has two properties that make it hazardous. First, DDT is non-biodegradable, which means that it is not broken down by metabolic processes in bacteria, plant, or animals. Second, when DDT is picked up by organisms, they do not eliminate it from their bodies. When aquatic plants pick up DDT from water, the pesticide is stored in their tissues. When herbivores eat those plants, they too store DDT. Because an herbivore eats many plants during its life, the DDT can become concentrated to levels 10 times higher than the levels found in plants. When carnivores eat herbivores, the toxic substances is concentrated further as shown in figure 6-16. In this process called biological magnification, concentrations of a harmful substance increase in organisms at higher trophic levels in a food chain or food web. Biological magnification affects the entire food web, although top-level carnivores are at the highest risk. In 1962, biologist Rachel Carson wrote a book called Silent Spring that alerted people to the dangers of biological magnification. The widespread spraying of DDT over many years had threatened populations of many animals, especially fish-eating birds like the osprey, brown pelican, and the bald eagle, with extinction. One effect of DDT was to make eggs of these birds so fragile that the eggs could not survive intact. By the early 1970s, DDT was banned in the United States and in most other industrialized countries. In the years since, scientists have noted a marked recovery in the populations of birds that had been affected. Bald eagles, for example, can once again be seen around rivers, lakes, and estuaries in the lower 48 states. History of Science. Tragedy in Minamata. A tragic example of biological magnification involved mercury, a byproduct in the manufacture of batteries. In humans, mercury affects the central nervous system, causing paralysis, mental illness, and even death. Some years ago, factories located around Minamata Bay in Japan discharged mercury into the sea in a supposedly safe, insoluble form. Microorganisms in the bay changed the mercury's form, making it soluble in seawater. The dissolved mercury was ingested by the phytoplankton and passed up the food chain. It reached dangerously high concentrations in fish, such as tuna and swordfish. Because the Japanese diet typically includes a great deal of fish, people in the Minamata area ingested large quantities of mercury, and many became terribly ill and died. Mothers gave birth to deformed and mentally retarded children. This tragedy is an example of why careful scientific studies are needed before disposing of waste products into the environment. Introduced species. One of the most important threats to biodiversity today comes from an unexpected source. Apparently, harmless plants and animals that humans transport around the world, either accidentally or intentionally. Introduced into new habitats, these organisms often become invasive species that reproduce rapidly. Invasive species increase their population because their new habitat lacks the parasites and predators that control their populations back home. Hundreds of invasive species, including the one in Figure 6.17, are already causing ecological problems in the United States. Zebra mussels and aquatic pests came on ships from Europe during the 1980s. They spread through the Great Lakes and several major rivers. These mussels reproduce and grow so quickly that they cause major ecological changes and are driving several native species close to extinction. There are also many examples on land. One European weed, that leafy spurge, now infests millions of hectares of grasslands across the northern Great Plains, where it displaces native plants. Conserving biodiversity. Most people would like to preserve Earth's biodiversity for future generations. In ecology, the term conservation is used to describe the wise management of natural resources, including the preservation of habitats and wildlife. The modern science of conservation biology seeks to protect biodiversity. To do so requires detailed information about ecological relationships, such as the way natural populations use their habitats, and integrate information from other scientific disciplines, such as genetics, geography, and natural resource management. Strategies for conservation. Many conservation efforts are aimed at managing individual species to keep them from becoming extinct. Some zoos, for example, have established captive breeding programs in which young animals are raised in protected surroundings until the population is stable, then are later returned to the wild. This strategy has succeeded with a few species, including the black-footed ferret. Today, conservation efforts focus on protecting entire ecosystems as well as single species. Protecting an ecosystem will ensure that the natural habitats and the interactions of many different species are preserved at the same time. This effort is much bigger challenge. Governments and conservation groups worldwide are working to set aside land or expand existing areas as parks and reserves. The United States has an extensive system of national parks, forests, and other protected areas. Marine sanctuaries are being designated to protect resources such as coral reefs and marine mammals. However, these areas may not be large enough or contain the right resources to protect biodiversity. Protecting species and ecosystem diversity in many places around the world is an enormous challenge. As part of the effort to locate problem areas and set up a list of priorities, conservation biologists often identify biodiversity hotspots, including those shown in Figure 6-18 on the following page. Each hotspot is a place where a significant number of habitats and species are in immediate danger or extinction as a result of human activity. The hotspot strategy may help scientists and governments to focus their efforts where they are not most needed. Conservation challenges. Protecting resources for the future can require people to change the way they earn their living today. Regulations that restrict fishing, for example, can impose severe financial hardships on fishers for several years. That's why conservation regulations must be informed by solid research and must try to maximize benefits while minimizing economic costs. But an ecological perspective tells us that if we do not take some difficult steps today, some resources may disappear. If that happens, many jobs that depend on ecosystem goods and services, such as fishing, will be lost permanently.